There are other types of equations that we can solve by using the zero product principle. It doesn't have to be quadratic. For example, if I had 5x to the fourth minus 20x squared equals 0, I can solve this by using the zero product principle by factoring out the greatest common factor of these two terms, and then once I have that product between the two factors, I can set each one equal to 0. So you can factor a 5 out of both of these terms, and you can factor an x squared out of both of these terms. And if I do that, then that's going to leave me with x squared minus 4. Okay, and now that I have this factored, I can set each factor equal to 0. So 5x squared equals 0, x squared minus 4 equals 0. So this first equation is easy to solve because you get x squared equals 0, and the square root of 0 is 0. So one of my answers is 0. The other answer you can either solve by factoring, or the other factor you can solve by factoring it, the difference of two squares, or you can solve by the square root property. Square root property says we just move the 4 over, and we take the square root of both sides. So that's going to be x equals plus or minus the square root of 4, which is 2. So your solution set is -2, 0, and 2. Those are your answers. It's pretty easy to solve by factoring out the greatest common factor. When do we do that? Usually when we just have two terms like this, so that whenever I factor something out, then I can easily solve what's left. Okay. Now the next type of equation we're going to solve by factoring is one that you may or may not have ever seen how to factor. And it is the method that we use to factor is called factoring by grouping. I never saw this in high school. And factoring by grouping works usually if you have 4 terms, and with those 4 terms you can group 2 sets of terms together to make one group, and 2 sets of the remaining terms together to make another group. For example, let's say that I had 4x cubed minus 12x squared equals 9x minus 27. The first thing that you want to do, if you want to attempt to factor by grouping, is to move everything to the same side of the equation. Since my largest power has a coefficient that's positive, I'm going to take these terms on the right side and move them over to the left side. I can join the party on the left side. Alright, so if it's a positive 9x on the right side of the equation, it'll be a negative 9x on the left side. If it's a negative 27 on the right side of the equation, it'll be a positive 27 on the left side. And so that leaves everything equal to 0. Which, if we're going to use the zero product principle to help us solve it, then we have to have the equation set equal to 0. Alright, so to use factoring by grouping, you need 4 terms, and usually the powers are, you have some power and then the other powers are just in descending order. So most of the time it's going to be x cubed, x squared, x to the first, and then a constant. In general, that's how your polynomial will be. Now what you want to do is you want to think about the first 2 terms like they're in their own group, and think about the second 2 terms like they're in their own group. Now take and factor the greatest common factor out of these 2 terms. So you can factor a 4 out of these 2 terms, and you can factor an x squared out of these 2 terms. So I'm going to factor a 4x squared just out of those 2 terms. Let's see what that leaves me with. X to the first minus what? 3. Alright, so I factored the greatest common factor out of these 2 terms, and I got 4x squared times x minus 3. Alright, now look at this second 2 terms. I want to factor the greatest common factor out of these 2 terms. And so since my first term is negative, I have a negative 9x. Instead of just factoring out a 9, I want to factor out a negative 9. I can't factor an x out because this second term in my second group doesn't have an x in it. I can only factor a negative 9 out. So what is that going to leave me from my first term? X. What is that going to leave me from my second term? A negative 3. Why negative 3? Because I factored a negative 9 out. And when we multiply the negative 9, if we were to multiply the negative 9 back in, we want to get a positive 27. Alright, so just to review, I put all the terms on one side. I made sure that they were in highest power to lowest power, all the way down to no power. I grouped the first 2 together, and I factored out the greatest common factor. I grouped the second 2 together, and I factored out the greatest common factor. Now the way that this factors, and you can tell right now if factoring by grouping is going to work, by looking, if you have the same thing in the parentheses, then it will factor by grouping. If you don't, it will not factor by grouping. Okay? So the way this factors, you make 2 sets of parentheses side by side, just like you would if you were factoring a quadratic. In one set of parentheses, you need to put what's on the outside of these 2 sets of parentheses. So you need to put 4x squared, because that's what's outside this set of parentheses, and then minus 9, because that's what's outside of this set of parentheses. The other parentheses, what was in both of these, the x minus 3, you put here. So the number on the outside of each set of parentheses goes in one set of parentheses, and then whatever you repeated goes in the other set of parentheses. Alright, so now that I have this thing factored, to solve it, you set each factor equal to 0. So 4x squared minus 9 equals 0, and x minus 3 equals 0. So solve this first equation here. If we want to solve for x, we're going to have to use the square root property, or that's probably the easiest way. It's not the only way, but probably the easiest. So that's 4x squared equals 9. Divide both sides by 4. So I get x squared equals 9/4. Now to solve for x, what do I need to do? Take the square root of both sides. So x equals plus or minus. The square root of 9 is 3 over the square root of 4 is 2. So one set of answers is plus or minus 3/2. That's a positive 3/2 and a negative 3/2. What's the other answer? That's right, positive 3. All right. Let me try one more, or show you how to do one more real quick. Let's say that I have 9y cubed plus 8 equals 4y plus 18y squared. Alright, so I need to move every term to one side of the equation. I also need to make sure that my terms are in highest power to lowest power all the way down to no power order. So if I move, here's my highest power, 9y cubed. I'm going to make sure that it stays positive because it has the highest power. It means the other stuff on the other side I'm going to take and move to the left side. Stuff on the right side, it's about to take a vacation to the left side. So I have 9y cubed, and move these two over. That's going to be minus 18y squared minus 4y. So they were both positive on the right side, they're both negative on the left side of the equation. Plus 8 equals 0. And notice that they're all now in order, highest power to no power. Now, group the first two terms together, factor out the greatest common factor. Group the second two terms together, factor out the greatest common factor. So that's 9y squared times y minus 2 Now here's where we can see if this will factor by grouping. Factor out the greatest common factor out of the second group. And so since this was a minus here, I'm going to have to factor out a negative 4. So it's minus 4 times y minus 2. Notice that what's in the parentheses is the same, both terms. That means you can factor this by grouping. So how do I do that? I make two sets of parentheses. In the first set of parentheses, I'm going to put what's on the outside of each of my previous two sets of parentheses. That's 9y squared minus 4. The other parentheses, I'm going to put what was in the previous two parentheses, the y minus 2. Now that's set equal to 0. To solve this, you set each factor equal to 0. So 9y squared over 4, 9y squared minus 4 equals 0, and y minus 2 equals 0. Now solve. I would use the square root property on the first equation because it doesn't have just the y term on this one. So move the 4 over. 9y squared equals 4. Divide both sides by 9. So y squared equals 4/9. To solve now, take the square root of both sides. So y equals plus or minus, it's the square root of a fraction, so the square root of the numerator, what's the square root of 4 is 2, over the square root of 9 is 3. So two of my answers, positive 2/3, negative 2/3. What's my third answer? Add 2 to both sides, y equals 2. Those are my three answers. That's my solution set. Negative 2/3, positive 2/3, and positive 2. Let's say I wanted to solve this polynomial. 2x to the 4th equals 16x. So it's just two terms. Anytime so far that I've had just two terms, we factor out the greatest common factor and set the factors equal to 0. Well, let's see what happens when I do that. So I have 2x to the 4th, and then when I move this over, it's minus 16x equals 0. Now out of these two, you can factor a 2 and then an x to the 1st. That's going to leave me with x cubed minus 8. Now, I do have this factored, but not factored completely because of this cube right here. This is the difference of two cubes. So, for the difference of two cubes, the way you factor that, it's going to be a minus b times a squared plus ab plus b squared. So we have to figure out to factor this completely, this x cubed minus 8, so that I can solve. You have to figure out what's being cubed. So what's being cubed to give you x cubed? The x. What's being cubed to give you 8? 2. Alright, so to use this formula, I'm going to plug everything into the formula. I'm going to let a equal x, and I'm going to let b equal 2. Okay, so make two sets of parentheses. One has 2 terms, the other has 3 terms. So a minus b, that's going to be x minus 2 times a squared, so x squared, plus ab, so a times b, that's x times 2, or positive 2x, and then plus b squared. B was 2, so plus 2 squared, or 4. Again, once you identify what's being cubed, then you plug them into the formula. Now I need to set all 3 of these equal to 0. So 2x equals 0, x minus 2 equals 0, and x squared plus 2x plus 4 equals 0. Now the first one you can solve pretty easy. Divide both sides by 2, you get x equals 0. The second one you can solve pretty easy. Add 2 to both sides, you get x equals positive 2. This is the one that will be a little more difficult or take a little more time, the next one, the quadratic, because the quadratic will never factor. It is guaranteed not to factor, so you can't solve it by factoring. You're going to have to solve it by quadratic formula. And you're always going to get an imaginary something. Okay? So you know right away that whenever you set this last factor equal to 0, no matter what it is, I guarantee you, if it's a quadratic and it came from a cube, it's not going to factor, and you're going to get some imaginary numbers in there. Alright, so I need to use the quadratic formula. So that's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So a is 1, b is 2, c is 4. So that's negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 4 all over 2 times a, which was 1. So I have negative 2 plus or minus the square root of, it's going to be 4 minus 16. So what's 4 minus 16? Negative 12 all over 2. Now simplify the square root of negative 12. That's going to be I plus or minus I times the square root of 12. What's the square root of 12 simplify to? The square root of 4 times the square root of 3. Or 2 square roots of 3. So that's 2I square roots of 3. Again, the I comes from the negative under the radical. The square root of 12 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, and the square root of 4 is 2. Now to check and see if this will simplify, you look at this number, and this number. If you can divide them all by the same number, then it will simplify. And you can divide them all by 2. So my last two answers are negative 1 plus or minus I square roots of 3. That means negative 1 plus I square roots of 3 and negative 1 minus I square roots of 3. So the only time we have to use the cubic, the sum or difference cubic formulas is if whenever you factor out the greatest common factor, you have a perfect cube. Alright, and it'll be a perfect cube minus a perfect cube or a perfect cube plus a perfect cube. And the way that you do that, again, these two formulas. Factoring the sum of cubes, use this formula. Using a factor in the difference of two cubes, use this formula. Alright. Now, the next type of equation that we're going to look at to solve is called a radical equation. funny thing about radical equations, or a little different thing about radical equations, so far when you find answers to your problems, it's kind of been optional to go back and plug in your answers. On these, you have to go back and plug in your answers, because sometimes if you don't, sometimes your answers don't work out with your original equation. Alright? So, radical equations, you must check. Alright, let's say that we had this radical equation. The square root of 20 minus 8x minus x equals 0. Alright, when you have a radical equation, if you have just one radical in your equation, what you want to do first is get that one radical by itself. So if there are any other terms on the same side as the radical, you want to move them over to the other side of the equation. So I want to move this x over. That's the first thing to do, so that I can get the radical on one side of the equation by itself. The next thing you do, we want to get rid of the radical. The only way I can get rid of that radical now, since I have this radical by itself, is to square both sides of the equation. If you square a square root, that cancels out. So the left side is now 20 minus 8x. The right side is now x squared. Now don't think I should put a plus or minus anywhere, because I didn't take a square root, I squared. There's a difference. It's kind of like doing the opposite. Remember, when you take a square root, you have to put a plus or minus on one side. But when you square, you don't. Now I need to move all of the terms to one side of the equation. Since my highest power is x squared, I'm going to move these two terms on the left side of the equation over to the right side, because the x squared is positive on the right side. And the reason why that's important is because if I can solve this by factoring, that's going to be my first option. The first method I try. Alright? Because that's the fastest. So I'm going to move the 20 over, say minus 20. And I'm going to move the 8x over and say plus 8x. And I also want to put these in order. So I'm going to put plus 8x minus 20. So I have x squared plus 8x minus 20 equals 0. So you get the radical by itself, you square both sides, and then if you have an x squared term, you're going to want to move everything to one side. Now you can solve this by completing the square, by the quadratic formula, but I'm going to see if it will factor. It's not guaranteed that it will, but I'm just going to hope that it will. So write down x and x. Now think about the factors of 20. We have 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5, alright, I think that's about it. So now, I want to plug these in so that I get a negative 20 out when I multiply them together. And then when I multiply these things times x, I want to get a positive 8. So since I want a negative here, one's going to have to be negative, one's going to have to be positive. So what about a plus 10 and a minus 2? So negative 2 times 10 is negative 20. And then if you check by multiplying the outer and inner, the outer terms gives me a 10x. the inner terms gives me a negative 2x. So 10 minus 2 is 8x, positive 8x. If you wonder why, a lot of times I factor, I just get it right away, is because I've practiced and I've practiced and I've practiced. It takes a lot of practicing to get good at factoring. So now that I have this factored, I can set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So I'll get x equals 2. And I get x equals negative 10. So those are my two answers. Now those are my two answers, I think. Because I said at the end, what do you have to do with radical equations? You must check them to see. Alright, so take your original equation. That was the square root of 20 minus 8x minus x equals 0. And first, we need to plug in 2 for everything and work it out. For x equals 2. I have the square root of 20 times negative 6 times 2. 20 minus negative 8 times 2. And then minus 2 equals 0. So this is the square root of 20 minus what? 16. 20 minus 16 is 4. So the square root of 4 minus 2 equals 0. 2 minus 2 equals 0. That's a true statement. 0 is equal to 0. It checks out. So what does that mean? That means that this is for sure an answer. Alright, now I'm going to check for x equals negative 10. Go back and plug it back into your original equation. So this is the square root of 20 minus 8 times negative 10. Then I have minus x. X is negative 10. When you plug a negative in, be careful. Plug it in parentheses. So this is the square root of 20, and that's going to be a negative 8 times a negative 10 is a positive 80. 20 and 80 is 100. But then look what I have here, minus negative 10, so it's going to be plus what? 10. So this gives me 10 plus 10 equals 0. Or 20 equals 0. Is 20 equal to 0? If I give you this $20 bill, you give me 0 in retirement, would be even? Well, maybe so, but no, those aren't equal. So that's a false statement. That tells me that x equals negative 10 is not a solution. So my only solution is x equals 2. And I guarantee you, if you're working a multiple choice problem on this, there's going to be one answer is probably going to be 2, one answer is probably going to be negative 10, one answer is probably going to be 2 and negative 10, and then one answer is probably going to be no solution. So you've got to know which ones are correct and which ones aren't. To review, the steps for working a radical equation. If you just have one radical in the equation, get that radical by itself. Then square both sides. Then, depending on what you have left over, if you have an x squared term, it's going to be a quadratic. Set your quadratic equal to 0 and solve by whatever method you know how. I solved by factoring on this one. At the very end, check your two answers back in your original equation. If you don't, check them in the original equation. then you're probably gonna miss it. Not probably, but maybe, because one of them may not work out, both of them may not work out. If they both don't work out, then it's no solution. They may both work out. So if you don't check, you're just kind of guessing from that point on. Now, one equation doesn't require too much work, really. You just move something over, square both sides, and then solve. Two equations, if you have a radical equation with two equations, that does take a little bit more time. Alright, so what you have to do if you have two equations, let's say I had the square root of 2x minus 3 minus the square root of x minus 2 equals 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to get one of the radicals by itself to start out with. Now, I would choose the one that's already positive. You know, this doesn't have a negative sign in front of it, so we consider it to be positive. And take this radical here, this other one, and move it across the equal sign. You move the whole thing like it's one term. So if it's a minus on this side, it's going to be a plus on the right side. So I have 1 plus the square root of x minus 2. Now I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to square both sides. Squaring the left side is pretty trivial. It just, if you square something with a radical, it just gets rid of the radical. That's on the left side. On the right side, it's a little more complicated. Because what does 1 plus the square root of x minus 2 squared mean? That means 1 plus the square root of x minus 2 times 1 plus the square root of x minus 2. Alright, and so you want to FOIL that out. Always. If you have more than one term, you're going to have to FOIL it out. So I'm going to multiply this whole thing. Multiply first terms, so that's 1. Multiply outer terms, so that is a plus 1 squared of x minus 2. Multiply inner terms, that is a plus 1 squared of x minus 2. Now multiply the last terms. When you multiply a radical times itself, you simply get what's under the radical. So plus x minus 2. Now, we do have like terms. This and this is a like term, and this and this is a like term. So 1 minus 2, that's negative 1. Then I'm going to put this term next, plus x. Now I'm going to put these two terms together. We have one of these and one of these, so that's going to be plus 2 of them. So 2 square root of x minus 2. Alright, so I just moved it on over. So what happens when you move one of the radicals over and you square both sides? You get rid of one of the radicals. That's good. Alright, because if you can get rid of one of the radicals by squaring both sides, then now, you see, we're just left with one radical right there. So now it's kind of like we're starting all over. Get this radical by itself. So this term right here, get it by itself. So move the other terms over. So I'm going to say plus 1 and minus x. Plus 1 minus x. Two x minus 1x is 1x. Negative 3 plus 1 is negative 2. Alright, so I have x minus 2 equals 2 times the square root of x minus 2. Now, once you get a radical by itself, square both sides. I know that you do have a number on the outside of the radical. Right here, you have a 2, but you still need to square it. So when you square the right side, you have to say 2 times 2, and you get 4. And it's going to be that times square root of x minus 2 times square root of x minus 2, or just x minus 2. The radical goes away. The number on the outside you have to square. Alright, now, on the left side, how do I multiply that out? I don't just square the first term and the last term. I have to FOIL that out, right? FOIL it out and simplify. X times x is x squared. X times negative 2 is negative 2x. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. That's going to be negative 4x. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. Now that I've squared both sides again, I have no radicals. Alright, so x squared minus 4x plus 4, and I'll multiply this in. Alright, that's going to be a 4x minus 8. So equals 4x minus 8. Since you have an x squared in the equation, you're going to have to, this is a quadratic. So you're going to have to move everything to one side and try to solve. So I'm saying minus 4x and plus 8. Minus 4x and plus 8. So I have x squared minus 8x plus 12 equals 0. Now you can solve this by any method you want, but I would first try by factoring because the majority of these will factor. So x. Alright, I want to get a negative 8. When I add them together, or whenever I add the two outer and inner terms together, I want to get a positive 12 when I multiply. So we have 1, 12, 2, 6, 3, 4. If I want to get a negative when I multiply, but I'm sorry, a positive when I multiply, but a negative in the middle, that means both terms are going to have to be negative. So what will a negative 2 and a negative 6 do for me? The outer terms gives me negative 6x. The inner terms gives me negative 2x. Negative 6x minus 2x is negative 8x. So that's how that factors. So we're almost done. Now we set each factor equal to 0. And we solve. So x equals 2. X equals 6. So we're almost done, but we're not done because we have to check. Alright, the original was the square root of 2x minus 3 minus the square root of x minus 2 equals 1. Alright, so take our two answers and plug them in. So for x equals 2, I have the square root of 2 times 2 is 4 minus 3 is 1 minus the square root of 0 equals 1. What's the square root of 1? 1. 1 minus 0, that is equal to 1. It checks out. So for sure, x equals 2 is a solution. Let's see if x equals 6 is. For x equals 6, the square root of 2 times 6 minus 3 minus the square root of 6 minus 2 equals 1. That's the square root of 9 minus the square root of 4 equals 1. 3 minus 2 equals 1. 1 equals 1. It checks out again, so guess what? X equals 6 is also a solution. So on that one, both solutions work out. Now the ones with 2 radicals are a little bit longer. So again, just a quick review. If you have 2 radicals, take one and move it over, then square both sides. When you square the side with 2 terms, remember you're going to have to FOIL that out. Once you've FOILed that out, and you have your equation right here, then you want to get the radical by itself again. So move the other terms over that's beside the radical, and again square both sides. After you do that, there are no radicals, but I do have an x squared term. So you're going to do something with a quadratic. So I moved everything to one side. I solved the quadratic equation, and I solved it by factoring, and I got x equals 2, x equals 6. The last thing we do is we check by plugging the 2 answers in the original. If they both check out, then both your answers are included in the solution set. If only one checks out, then that's fine. If neither check out, the answer is no solution.